good afternoon. I'm Paul Rogers, and this is the second session of the afternoon, and it's good to see so many people here. As some of you will have known, Sarah Perigo joined us early on. I think she's still with us. I'm also delighted to welcome Michael Randall, who many of you will know over many years, an extraordinary career, and he's actually just joined us for this session, which is absolutely appropriate, looking at peace studies, past, present, and I think we want to also make sure it's looking at the future as well, not least with one of the sessions tomorrow morning where we have a number of the newer members of staff giving their perspectives on how the department may develop in the future. So thank you for that. For this afternoon, essentially, we just have Tom Woodhouse, Simon Whitby. So basically, it's really to look at what the department has been doing in the past, with very much an eye to the future. We'll try and fit it into an hour, so there's half an hour of discussion. I'd like a few minutes at the end, very few minutes, just to reflect on where we go from here. Straight on to Professor Simon Whitby to look at the, if you like, the next period of peace studies. Simon, over to you.
Thanks for this opportunity to talk to you today. I want to talk a little bit about Adam Curl, but the transition really from the Curl period to the James O'Connell period. James O'Connell being the second professor of peace studies, who came here in 1978 when Adam decided to retire. I want to be a little bit more critical, if I may, Tom, but only a little bit. I was going to be slightly controversial, but since Michael Randall has joined us, then I think I'm going to tone that down a little bit. You'll understand why that's the case when we get to that bit. Peace studies, though, has courted controversy. I personally think that the O'Connell period, which ran from 1978 to 1993, was a period of much more controversy, and the department attracted much more attention from people that matter than the controversy that was courted during the Curl period. And I hope to be able to explain why I think that's the case. But you can see from this that peace studies had enemies in high places. And peace studies was discussed several times in the House of Lords. Rhodes Boyson was not a fan and referred to it as a left-wing Trojan horse. And Lord Belloff is also recorded in Hansard as referring to it as a rest camp for urban guerrillas, which I think some of you will be quite pleased about. So Adam, reflecting on what he started after a period of time, speculated whether or not peace studies at Bradford would be a piece of grit in the oyster of the university, and speculated further to say, herein lies the possibility that it may be transformed into a pearl. So I'll leave you to decide, what happened in that regard. Just as a matter of interest, I suppose the question is, Bradford's maybe moved on. I'm not sure whether peace studies has, or to what extent it has. This is taken from the Bradford Telegraph and Argus, and it makes the observation that 3 Rhodesians, 2 of them black, recently began working with 14 colleagues in peace studies at Bradford. And the same article went on to note that peace studies had attracted students from as far afield as Thailand and Iran, Australia, America, and Jamaica. So I think Tom has really covered the Curl sort of history, evolution, at least in the early days, quite well. I think one of the really difficult things that Curl was confronted with was how to sort of come up with a formulation as to how the study of peace could be sort of explained and sold. The idea of studying peace in university was quite a thing. Weirdly, it's much more acceptable to study war than it is to study peace, and we can talk about that a bit later. But the founders, in other words, the Society of Friends, the Quakers, as well as Ted Edwards, the Vice-Chancellor, and Pro-Vice-Chancellor McKinley, who was a Quaker, gave Adam a clear mandate to try and articulate the aims and objectives, scope, limitations, boundaries of its study, number one, and also to somehow come up with a formulation as to how its applied orientation would work in a university setting, which is actually quite a challenging thing to do in many ways. And so Adam, in some ways, set about doing this, both for internal consumption, but also for external consumption as well. One of the things in order to do this, he he began to talk about unpeaceful relationships, and he wrote, by this I mean relationships with in which the potentiality for growth, fulfillment, self-realization, or whatever one likes to call it for individual or group or nation is damaged or curtailed. So this is an initial formulation of unpeaceful relationships. My feeling is that Curl's thinking in this very narrow sense was influenced very much by the work of Johann Galtung. And in this piece, we can see Curl explaining similarities and differences. And he says that although Galtung employs different terms, his concept of violence is close to mine, of the unpeaceful relationship in which, while there may be no overt conflict behavior, damage is done to human potential and the seeds of future open conflict or personal violence are sown. So what Adam did was he came with this formulation of essential tasks, two of them. And the first task, he argued, was that peace studies should identify and analyze unpeaceful relationships. That's the first thing. And then the second thing, the next function is to use this information in order to devise means of changing unpeaceful relationships into peaceful relationships, okay? So he goes on to say, one only really finds out about them, that is, peaceful relationships, through the attempt to practice them. And this seemed to me to be entirely consistent with the mandate that was given to Adam by the Vice-Chancellor, the Provost-Chancellor, and the Society of Friends, who were mostly concerned about the problem of nuclear war at the time. Not to the exclusion of anything else particularly, but that's one of the things they placed an emphasis on. One of the issues, of course, is that, I mean, depending on what your view of universities is, they're very hierarchically organized structures, and they rely on, promotion and status and so on and so forth. The university was seen as a less peaceful structure, and the challenge was to establish a peaceful society in a relatively less peaceful structure. And Adam thought that it would be a good idea to bring a concept, a tradition from his experience at Harvard University, whereby they had a democracy. They instituted a democracy in some ways looks a little bit like a consensual sort of Quaker business meeting. A consensual collective democracy was established, and students had equal say with respect to what should be taught, what should be on the curriculum, how it should be taught, who should be employed, who should be selected, indeed. And it was common on Monday mornings that students would be opening mail in the office with Adam Curl, pertaining potentially to the employment of future members of staff. Some students and prominent members of peace studies, Bob Overy is cited here in particular, felt that this soon descended into, I suppose, what could be politely referred to as chaos. What developed, Bob said, was in some ways a power vacuum at the centre, with staff and students competing to make initiatives or block them. Division between staff along ideological lines became pronounced, with students aligning themselves to a greater or lesser degree with the object of competing ideological factions. So this is very difficult to summarize because there's so much going on, but Simon Midgley had a good go at this in the pages of the Times Higher Education Supplement. And although this is a bit kind of pretentious, demands for a just peace, he argued, led to the subject becoming too diffuse, a burgeoning portmanteau becoming ever more capacious in response to student demand, but increasingly debilitated by a receding sense of direction and focus. I'm not sure whether the people who were here at the time, whether that chimes with them or not. But in some ways, I feel the unpeaceful, peaceful relationships, this is a sort of a partly marketing, partly rhetorical sort of exercise, didn't really establish firm foundations for what really should go on in peace studies. And so that was a problem. And the other side, so that was the academic, intellectual side in relation to the scope, limitations, and boundaries of what peace studies was, very difficult for one person to define when he was joined, of course, by all of these students from all over the world with different agendas, different ideological commitments. And so the academic side was, and the democracy was a sort of a forum where dispute sort of played out, as it were. In regard to activism, I don't think this was clearly articulated either, but students felt that the fact that they were enrolled on a degree in peace studies gave them a mandate to be activists. And this is a list, and I think it's worth reading out. This is a list of what the students were active in regard to. So the women's movement, ecology, justice in the third world, anti-radical movements, trade union movements, preservation of human rights, abolition of torture, gay movement, children's rights, radical therapy, mental health, prisoner rights, decentralization in economic, social, and political life, alternative lifestyles, movement for animal liberation, movements to replace hierarchical systems by collective methods of working. Again, Simon Midgley summarizes this quite nicely, I think, in the Times Higher Education Supplement, where he said, for some years, there was a continuing debate about how much academic credit should be awarded for what, in any other academic department, might be regarded as extramural activity. So instead of delivering assignments in accordance with the deadline, students would, in some cases, deliver cake that they'd baked. And they, you know, this is a symbolic gesture, but that you get the general idea. The idea of this hierarchical, very conservative university institution did indeed begin to court controversy, and within the university, both within and from outside of the university. And in again, writing in The Friend, Curl welcomed the prospect that a new approach was really needed. At the time, he argued, is ripe for an infusion of new ideas. So here's the critical bit. I think, in very simplistic terms, Curl came up with this thing about peaceful relationships in the primary task and the secondary task. I think that was quite simple. It's partly marketing for internal consumption and external consumption. It was certainly derivative. I think I'm right in saying that what's going on in peace studies, notwithstanding the work that Curl had done, really relied upon conceptualizations that already existed in philosophy, economics, sociology, international relations, economics, post-colonialism, development, gender studies, etc. And also, I think Curl's initial thinking about peaceful relationships, from my side, is really rhetorical in terms of its analytical utility. I think very limited. This criticism, though, does not necessarily apply to Curl's wider work on peace in and outer the spiritual dimension of peacemaking, his work on love and other issues. I think I've run out of time, but let me just speed through to this, which is to say, under O'Connell, there was a great deal of controversy. Books like Lambs to the Slaughter, Paul's work with Tansy L on the Falklands campaign. Peace studies was considered to be the brains behind C&D. Paul working, just to go back, sorry to reiterate, work on the sinking of the Belgrano, which embarrassed Margaret Thatcher. Peace education, peace studies was considered to be the brains behind peace education. It was discussed in the House of Lords, already seen, and it earned some hostility and enemies in the form of Baroness Cox, Sir Keith Joseph, Margaret Thatcher, and Roger Scruton in particular, who wrote a lot about and were critical about peace studies. The controversial bit, I think, was the Alternative Defence Commission. I don't think the university knew about at the time that Michael's role in the springing of George Blake from Wormwood Scrubs prison. And you should read about that. It's a fantastic story. George Blake was moved from various safe houses in London to others and sort of moved around and appeared on television as the world, you know, the UK's most wanted man. And that was fine. He, while staying in the house or the apartment of a radical Christian preacher, the wife of the Christian preacher was unfortunately experienced mental health issues and had to go to counselling, psychotherapy. And of course, went to her psychotherapist one day and said, and this is according to Richard Norton Taylor, who wrote about this, that she claimed to her counsellor that the UK's most wanted man, George Blake, was living in her apartment. To which her counsellor said, well, I think you're hallucinating, and changed the medication, you know. So the least said about that, maybe the better. Just one question, and that is whether peace studies is an area of study in terms of its distinctiveness, you know, what is it? And so what evidence is there? My question will be that peace studies should no longer be thought of as an area of study, because that's what it became under O'Connell. And the applied orientation morphed into and was summarized in a phrase, scholarship is our activism. So is there any evidence, intellectual, methodological, ontological, theoretical, empirical, that peace studies is distinct in 2024? Is it appropriate and acceptable to refer to it as a discipline? And is there any evidence to suggest that alternative applied academic policy orientation has emerged that challenges the organisation that we arrived at under O'Connell, which was to say scholarship is our activism, where our applied and academic work was channeled into policy research, and that's what activism became. So thank you for your attention.